Somewhere beneath the gilded surface of Renaissance masterpieces, a secret has been waiting for 5 centuries to be uncovered. Europe had spent 1,000 years in shadow, and then, almost without warning, the world changed. Ancient knowledge thought lost forever began resurfacing in libraries no one could fully explain. Behind the brushstrokes of legendary painters and the notebooks of visionary inventors lay the hidden hands of dynasties, scholars, and fallen empires. The answers may reach further than Florence, further than Rome, all the way to lost libraries and civilizations swallowed by time. What truly ignited the Renaissance? And what secrets did it bury along the way? Welcome back to Whispered Empires, where ancient worlds awaken beneath quiet narration and the forgotten past speaks again in the stillness of the night. If you find comfort in slowly told history, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel, but only if this is genuinely the kind of storytelling you treasure. And if you feel moved to do so, leave a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from and what time it is where you are. There is something quietly extraordinary about knowing that people in different cities and different time zones are settling into the same story tonight. Before we begin, a question worth carrying with you through the hours ahead. If you could recover one lost piece of knowledge from the ancient world, what would you most wish to find? Take a slow breath now. Let your shoulders drop. Let the outside world grow distant, and allow yourself to drift into the story of the entire story of the Renaissance. Chapter 1. The World Before the Rebirth. Medieval Europe and the Long Shadow of Rome. There is a particular quality to ruins at dusk. The way the last light of the sun falls across crumbling stone, tracing the outlines of something that was once vast and ordered and full of life. In the cities of medieval Italy, this was not merely a poetic image, it was an ordinary fact of existence. The Colosseum still rose above Rome's rooftops, immense and patient. Columns leaned in old forums. Aqueducts stretched across the countryside, their arches reflecting in still pools below. The ancient world had not entirely vanished. It had simply grown quiet. Long before the Renaissance would illuminate Europe's cultural imagination, long before the painters and poets and philosophers of that great flowering would look backward with such longing toward antiquity, there was this world, a slower world, a world built in the long shadow of something lost. It is here, in this dimly lit age, that the story truly begins. The Western Roman Empire had fallen in 476 CE, not in a single dramatic moment, but through a long and gradual unravelling. Internal pressures had worn it hollow over centuries. Political instability produced ineffective rulers. Corruption spread through the civil administration. Heavy taxation exhausted the population. The armies, once disciplined and loyal, had become mercenary forces drawn from many peoples, their allegiance uncertain, and at the frontiers, wave after wave of Germanic peoples pressed inward, Visigoths, Vandals, Ostrogoths, Franks, carving out successor kingdoms from what had been Roman territory. When the last Western emperor was deposed, the vast machinery of empire did not simply stop, it transformed. Roman law survived, woven into the legal codes of the new kingdoms and into the canonical traditions of the Church. The Latin language endured as the tongue of scholarship, administration, and liturgy. The layouts of Roman cities continued to shape the streets and marketplaces of European towns. The physical bones of empire remained, quietly present beneath the medieval world that grew up around them. In the absence of imperial authority, one institution rose to fill the space: the Catholic Church. It was the church that preserved the fragile chain of literacy. In monasteries scattered across Ireland, Britain, France, and Italy, monks gathered in scriptoria, candle-lit rooms filled with the soft sound of quill on parchment, and copied the texts of an older world. They reproduced the works of Virgil and Cicero, of Homer and Plato and Aristotle, of the historians Thucydides and Herodotus. They preserved Pliny's encyclopedic accounts of the natural world and Boethius's reflections on philosophy written in the shadow of his own execution. The Carolingian Renaissance of the 8th and 9th centuries brought renewed effort to this work, standardizing scripts and expanding libraries so that the thread connecting the present to classical antiquity remained, however slender, unbroken. Yet the Church's role was not simply that of a neutral guardian, it was also a gatekeeper. Cathedral schools and monastic institutions provided nearly all formal education, and that education was carefully shaped to serve theological ends. The liberal arts, grammar, logic, rhetoric, were taught only insofar as they supported Christian doctrine. Scholarship flourished when it illuminated sacred truth. When it questioned sacred truth, it was suppressed. Heretical thought, secular philosophy that challenged doctrinal authority, scientific ideas that conflicted with scripture, these were not welcome within the walls of medieval learning. Artistic production followed the same pattern. The magnificent traditions of medieval art, from the gilded mosaics of Ravenna to the soaring arches of Gothic cathedrals, from the jewel-like illuminated manuscripts of Irish monasteries to the sea-sweeping frescoes of Romanesque churches, were overwhelmingly ecclesiastical in commission and theological in purpose. Artists worked within strict iconographic conventions. Saints and biblical figures were rendered in prescribed gestures, prescribed colours, prescribed hierarchies of scale. Realism was not the goal. Clarity of spiritual meaning was. The image existed not to delight the eye for its own sake, but to teach, to remind, to draw the faithful upward toward the divine. The great philosophical minds of the medieval period worked within this same framework. Thinkers such as Augustine of Hippo, Thomas Aquinas, Bonaventure, Anselm of Canterbury, and William of Ockham engaged deeply with the recovered works of Aristotle and the Neoplatonic ideas flowing through Plato's dialogues. As Arabic translations and later direct Latin renderings of the full Aristotelian corpus arrived in Europe during the 12th century, the universities of Paris and Bologna became places where ancient Greek philosophy was seriously studied and carefully reconciled with Christian revelation. Thomas Aquinas famously used Aristotle's natural philosophical system to construct elegant arguments for the existence and attributes of God. Ancient wisdom was welcomed, but only as a handmaiden to theology. This was a world of immense intellectual energy, contained within firm boundaries. And yet, even within those boundaries, something was quietly shifting. In the Italian city-states in particular, a distinctive consciousness was taking shape. Unlike the feudal kingdoms of northern Europe, the cities of Italy, Florence, Venice, Genoa, Milan, were dense urban centres where commerce, not hereditary nobility, determined influence and power. Merchant and banking families accumulated wealth that rivaled and eventually surpassed the old landed aristocracy. Trade routes across the Mediterranean connected these cities to the Byzantine world, to the Arab lands, to the silks and spices of the Far East. Wealth flowed in, ideas travelled with it. In this environment, the Roman ruins that surrounded daily life carried a particular weight. A Florentine merchant walking to his warehouse might pass a fragment of ancient column incorporated into a church wall. A Roman citizen might pause beneath the shadow of the Colosseum, its enormous arches still intact, still speaking of a civilization that had organized the known world. These ruins were not merely picturesque, they were symbols, they were memory in stone. They inspired early humanist scholars to collect inscriptions, to study ancient sarcophagi, to copy classical motifs into their own buildings. They fed a growing sense that something extraordinary had once existed here, and that its loss had been immense. In the late medieval period, the mercantile class that had been quietly gathering wealth and influence began to use that wealth in ways that would prove transformative. Banking families such as the Medici built grand palaces, sponsored public works, and commissioned works of art. The intense rivalry between city-states turned cultural patronage into a measure of civic prestige. The conditions for a great cultural flowering were being assembled, slowly and almost imperceptibly, through the daily transactions of traders, bankers, and ambitious families who wanted to be remembered. Then came the plague. In the autumn of 1347, a fleet of Genoese ships arrived in the Sicilian port of Messina from the Black Sea. The sailors were dead or dying. Those still living were covered in black swellings, hard, painful masses that ooze blood and pus. The harbour authorities ordered the ships out of port immediately, but it was already too late. The illness slipped ashore. Within months, it was moving across Italy. By mid-1348, it had crossed into France, Spain, Portugal, and England. By 1350, it had swept through Germany, the Low Countries, and Scandinavia. By 1352, it had reached the edges of Russia. The bacterium Yersinia pestis, carried by fleas and rats, and spreading also through the air in its most terrible pneumonic form, moved along the same trade routes that had carried silk and spices and ideas, turning the networks of medieval commerce into channels of catastrophe. Approximately 25 million people died, roughly a third to half of all Europeans. In England, France, Italy, and Spain, the losses in some regions reached 50 to 60%. Nearly 1,000 English villages were simply abandoned. The land fell quiet in ways it had not been quiet in living memory. The psychological impact of this devastation is difficult to fully comprehend across the distance of centuries. The medieval worldview rested on a foundation of divine order, the belief that life, however difficult, followed a pattern sanctioned by God, administered through the church, and expressed in the steady rhythms of feudal society. The plague shattered that foundation. Priests died as readily as peasants. Religious processions and prayers offered no protection. The church's rituals, the last rites, the sacraments that were supposed to accompany every soul from life into death, were often abandoned simply because there were too many bodies and too few clergy left alive. Ordinary Europeans watched their neighbours die without the comfort of sacred ceremony. They watched the church fail. They watched learned physicians armed with centuries of inherited medical theory stand helpless before a disease they could not explain and could not stop. The authority of every traditional institution, ecclesiastical, medical, feudal, was exposed as fragile, contingent, insufficient. And from this terrible exposure, something quietly began to shift. The labour shortage that followed the plague transformed the social order in ways that no doctrine and no statute could fully contain. Surviving peasants found themselves in possession of something they had rarely held before: bargaining power. With so many workers dead, landlords needed the living ones desperately. Wages rose, serfdom weakened, peasants moved, negotiated, demanded. The rigid hierarchy that had organised medieval society for centuries began to loosen at its joints. New colleges were established rapidly to fill the void left by dead clergy. Lay people took on greater roles in parish life. Vernacular texts, medical, practical, devotional, began to circulate more widely, bypassing the Latin-educated elite and reaching people who had never had direct access to written knowledge before. The monopoly over learning that had been the church's most powerful cultural tool was beginning very slowly to erode. Meanwhile, the mercantile classes who had survived and even benefited from the economic disruption found themselves positioned to shape the world that was slowly reassembling itself. Per capita incomes rose as populations shrank and resources concentrated among fewer hands. Commercial expansion resumed. The wealthy families of the Italian city-states continued to build, commission and sponsor. And the ruins of Rome continue to stand in their streets, patient, enduring, waiting. The medieval world had been a world of extraordinary faith and extraordinary constraint, a world that had preserved the fragments of antiquity even while holding them at arm's length, a world whose intellectual traditions were rich and genuine, but whose boundaries were firm. A world that had now been shaken to its deepest foundations by a catastrophe so vast and so indiscriminate that nothing, not ecclesiastical authority, not feudal obligation, not inherited medical wisdom, had proven equal to it. In the aftermath of that shaking, the ground was different, not yet transformed, but loosened, uncertain, and in some profound, slow-moving way, open. Yet even as the Black Death loosened the grip of medieval certainty, the true spark of the Renaissance would come not only from within Europe's own ruins, but from knowledge arriving from distant and unexpected places, knowledge that had been travelling for centuries toward this precise historical moment. Chapter 2. The Return of Lost Knowledge, Ancient Manuscripts, Islamic Scholars, and the Byzantine Inheritance. Long before the cities of Italy began to stir with new ideas, the great works of the ancient world were already being tended elsewhere. Quietly, carefully, across centuries and civilizations that Western Europe had barely glimpsed. In the 8th century, something remarkable was taking shape in the city of Baghdad. Under the Abbasid Caliphate, a centre of learning known as the House of Wisdom began gathering scholars from across the known world, Persian, Greek, Indian, Chinese, drawing together their texts, their methods, their accumulated understanding of the universe. This was the beginning of what historians would come to call the Islamic Golden Age, a period of intellectual flowering that would last in various forms for more than 500 years. The scholars who worked within this tradition were not simply copying what had come before them. They were reading, questioning, expanding, and transforming ancient knowledge into something new. A mathematician named Al-Khwarizmi developed the foundations of algebra and algorithms, tools of thought so fundamental that his name would eventually give the world the word algorithm itself. Ibn al-Haytham turned his careful attention to the nature of light and vision, conducting experiments that placed him among the earliest practitioners of what we would now recognize as scientific methodology. Ibn Sina, known in the Latin West as Avicenna, wrote a comprehensive medical encyclopedia called the Canon of Medicine, a text so thorough, so systematically organized, that it would remain a standard reference in both the Islamic world and medieval Europe for centuries after his death. These were not isolated achievements. Across the Islamic world, scholars were making advances in surgery, astronomy, chemistry, geography, and philosophy. And woven through all of this work was something perhaps even more significant: a deep and disciplined engagement with the ancient Greeks. The great works of Aristotle, his writings on logic, physics, metaphysics, and ethics, were translated into Arabic, studied, and commented upon with extraordinary care. Plato's dialogues, Euclid's geometry, Ptolemy's astronomy, the medical writings of Hippocrates and Galen, the pharmacological observations of Dioscorides, all of these found their way into Arabic, often accompanied by extensive commentary and original additions from Islamic thinkers. Among the most important of these commentators was Averroes, Ibn Rushd, a scholar from Al-Andalus in Islamic Spain, who devoted much of his life to producing detailed Arabic commentaries on Aristotle's logical and natural works. His readings were so thorough, so clarifying, that later Latin translators would come to call him simply the commentator, as if no further description were needed. Al-Farabi before him had worked to integrate Aristotle and Plato with Islamic thought, exploring logic, metaphysics, political philosophy, and even music theory. Al-Kindi, sometimes called the first Arab philosopher, had written the earliest Arabic treatises on Aristotelian logic, advocating for the possibility of reconciling reason with faith. Together, these thinkers formed a chain of understanding that stretched back to Athens and forward toward a Europe not yet ready to receive what they were preserving. The question, then, is how this vast body of knowledge found its way westward. The answer is gradual, and it moves through geography as much as through time. The most important doorways were the borderlands, places where Islamic, Christian, and Jewish cultures met and sometimes, despite their differences, learned from one another. Chief among these was the Iberian Peninsula, particularly the city of Toledo, where in the 12th and 13th centuries multilingual scholars gathered to translate Arabic texts into Latin. Gerard of Cremona worked there with tireless dedication, rendering Ptolemy's Almagest, the works of Avicenna, and dozens of other texts into the language of European scholarship. Elsewhere, the island of Sicily and the courts of southern Italy, under Norman and then Hohenstaufen rulers who embraced both Arabic and Greek learning, became another channel through which ancient knowledge flowed northward. The Crusades too played their part. Whatever violence and upheaval they carried, the long European presence in the Levant brought soldiers and pilgrims and merchants into sustained contact with Islamic cities where the sciences and arts had developed in ways that far surpassed what they had left behind. Arabic manuscripts on astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and optics made their way back westward, adding new currents to the growing stream. Adelard of Bath travelled through the Islamic world and brought Euclid back to England in Arabic form. Stephen of Antioch urged his contemporaries to learn geometry before attempting medicine. Slowly, haltingly, the classical corpus, filtered through centuries of Islamic scholarship and commentary, began to reshape the curricula of European universities, the practices of European physicians, the calculations of the European astronomers. But there was another river of knowledge flowing quietly alongside this one, and it ran through a city that much of Europe had almost forgotten to think about. Constantinople, the great capital of the Byzantine Empire, had never lost the ancient Greek texts at all. While Western Europe had struggled through the long centuries of fragmentation that followed the fall of Rome, the Byzantines had maintained an unbroken connection to the classical world. Greek was their living language. Aristotle and Plato were not distant, half-remembered names. They were authors taught in schools, discussed in courts, copied in monasteries. The full works of Homer, the complete dialogues of Plato, the entire Aristotelian corpus, the writings of the Neoplatonist philosophers, these existed in Constantinople not as curiosities, but as the living fabric of an educated civilization. The University of Constantinople employed salaried scholars who taught from classical texts as a matter of course. Monastic scriptoria copied manuscripts generation after generation. The patriarchal library, the Hagia Sophia scriptorium, private collections scattered across the city. All of these held texts that had not been seen in Western Europe for 1,000 years. But the 14th century brought shadows to Constantinople that would deepen with each passing decade. Civil wars tore through the empire with grinding regularity. The conflicts of the 1320s, the 1340s, each one draining the treasury, corrupting the land grant system that had once sustained the military, handing customs revenues to Genoese merchants in Galata, who extracted far more from the Bosporus than the empire itself could collect. The Ottoman Turks had secured a foothold in Europe at Gallipoli in 1354, and from that point onward, the territory of the empire shrank year by year, decade by decade, like water slowly retreating from the shore. And so, before the final collapse came, scholars began to leave. Manuel Chrysoloras arrived in Florence as early as 1395, and what he brought with him was something Italian humanists had been reaching toward without quite knowing how to grasp, and fluency in ancient Greek. He taught it patiently and systematically to a generation of Florentine scholars who had been working with Roman texts for decades but had no direct access to the Greek originals. The philosopher Gemistos Plethon arrived in Florence in 1438 for the Great Council of Florence, and his lectures on Plato and the Neoplatonic tradition left a mark on the city that would last for generations. Cosimo de' Medici, the powerful and quietly brilliant patriarch of Florence's most influential family, listened to Plethon speak, and something kindled in him. He would later sponsor the re-establishment of a Platonic academy in Florence, a gathering of scholars and artists devoted to the philosophy that Plethon had breathed back into life. Plethon himself was a remarkable figure, perhaps the last great Greek Platonist of the medieval world, educated in Constantinople, deeply versed in the late antique Neoplatonic tradition of Plotinus, Proclus, and Iamblichus. He championed not merely an academic revival of Plato, but something more radical, a philosophical vision that looked past Christianity toward the ancient Greek cosmology itself, earning him the name the Second Plato from those who heard him speak. Then, on the 29th of May in the year 1453, Sultan Mehmed II, 21 years old and already a figure of formidable ambition, completed a siege of Constantinople that had lasted nearly 2 months. The last Byzantine emperor, Constantine XI Palaiologos, died in the fighting. The city was sacked for 3 days, and with it the imperial library, estimated to have held more than 100,000 volumes, was scattered, burned, looted, or simply lost beneath the feet of armies that had no use for Greek manuscripts. The works that vanished in those days are impossible to count with certainty. Unique copies of lost plays by Aeschylus, Sophocles and Euripides, historical chronicles, diplomatic correspondence, theological commentaries, illuminated codices, papyrus fragments, works of the pre-Socratic philosophers that had survived for 2,000 years only to disappear in the smoke of a single season. But something crucial had already escaped. In the years before 1453, and in the decades that followed, a wave of Byzantine scholars carried what they could to the cities of Italy. Cardinal Bessarion brought a vast personal library to Rome. John Argyropoulos taught Aristotle and Plato at the courts of Milan and Florence. George of Trebizond brought critical editions of classical texts and translated many of them. After the fall, more came: Janus Lascaris, Constantine Lascaris, Demetrios Chalkokondyles, Theodorus Garza, Andronikos Kallistos, establishing Greek schools and translation workshops in Venice, Florence, and Rome, training Italian scholars, sharing manuscripts that had been copied and preserved across centuries of Byzantine scholarship. Complete codices of Plato's dialogues, the entire Aristotelian corpus, Euclid's Elements, the Almagest of Ptolemy, the medical writings of Hippocrates and Galen, Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, Herodotus, Thucydides, Sophocles, texts that Italian humanists had been labouring toward for a century, suddenly present in their original language, held in human hands that had travelled across the Aegean to place them on the tables of Florence. The young Marsilio Ficino, scholar, Catholic priest, and eventually the intellectual heart of Cosimo's Platonic Academy, set himself the extraordinary task of translating the entire corpus of Plato into Latin. He completed it in 1484. He also rendered into Latin the writings of Plotinus, Porphyry, Iamblichus, and the ancient Hermetic texts, opening a door between the ancient Greek philosophical tradition and a European scholarly world that had for centuries known Plato mostly by reputation. The Neoplatonism that Ficino and his colleagues embraced offered something different from the Aristotelian scholasticism that had long dominated medieval theology, where scholasticism grounded itself in logic, causality, and a careful analysis of the material world. Neoplatonism spoke of an ascent of the soul, of illumination, of a hierarchy of being emanating outward from a single divine source. It was mystical where scholasticism was analytical, contemplative where scholasticism was dialectical, and yet it is important to hold gently the idea that all of this represented a sudden rupture, a sharp break between medieval darkness and Renaissance light. Historians have long debated that question. The classical texts were not, in truth, entirely absent from Europe's medieval centuries. They'd been flowing in from Toledo and Sicily since the 12th century. Some threads of Aristotle had never been completely lost. What the Byzantine scholars brought was not a resurrection from nothing but an acceleration, a deepening, a widening, a return of original sources that had been mediated through Arabic commentary and partial Latin translation for 2 centuries. Scholars now recognize that perhaps 70 to 80% of the ancient Greek scientific corpus had been preserved in Arabic, and roughly 9/10 of the broader Greek literary tradition had been continuously maintained in Byzantine scriptoria. What medieval Europe had lacked was not so much the existence of this knowledge as direct access to it in its original language, with all the nuance and depth that entailed. What the 15th century brought then was something like a confluence, the long Islamic tradition of preservation and expansion meeting the Byzantine inheritance of unbroken Greek literacy, both of them arriving together in the fertile, restless, and extraordinarily well-funded world of Italian city life. The concept of studia humanitatis, grammar, rhetoric, poetry, history, and moral philosophy had been quietly assembling itself as an educational ideal since the 14th century, drawing on the recovered classical text to build a curriculum centered not on theology alone, but on the study of human beings, human language, and human virtue. Scholars like Leonardo Bruni, Guarino of Verona, Poggio Bracciolini, and Francesco Filelfo had been reaching toward this ideal for decades. The arrival of the Byzantine scholars gave them the tools to go further. A civilization that had been slowly gathering its inheritance across centuries was on the edge of something it could not yet fully name. As ancient wisdom flooded back into European minds through manuscripts and exiled scholars, it found fertile ground in a handful of extraordinary Italian cities, places where wealth, ambition, and political rivalry created the perfect conditions for civilization to bloom in ways the world had not witnessed for over 1,000 years. Chapter 3: The Cities of the Renaissance, Florence, Venice, Rome, and the Power of the Medici. In the gentle folds of the Italian peninsula, where ancient rivers wound through valleys of cypress and stone, there arose in the 14th and 15th centuries a world unlike any other that Europe had ever known. Not the world of great hereditary kings seated upon distant thrones, commanding vast territories by birthright alone, but something far more intimate and, in its own way, far more extraordinary. A world of cities, independent, proud and fiercely alive, while the monarchies of Northern Europe, France, England, the great Germanic territories of the Holy Roman Empire, concentrated authority in the hands of a single hereditary ruler, the cities of Italy answered to no such arrangement. Venice elected its doge through ancient ceremonial processes and governed through layered councils of merchant oligarchs. Florence organised itself around a rotating magistracy known as the Signoria, in which 9 elected members held power for only 2 months at a time, a system designed to prevent any single hand from gripping the city too tightly. Each of these city-states minted its own coins, raised its own armies, negotiated its own treaties, and conducted its own foreign affairs as freely as any sovereign nation. They were not provinces of a greater kingdom, they were worlds unto themselves, and it was precisely this independence, this fierce and restless pride that made them so remarkable. The competition between these cities was constant and quietly ferocious, not always in the blunt language of armies and sieges, though that too had its seasons, but in the more enduring language of stone and paint and gold. Each city sought to outshine its neighbours, to attract the admiration of merchants and diplomats and scholars, to announce to all who passed through its gates that here, in this place, civilization had reached its finest expression. The immense revenues flowing from trade and manufacture gave the ruling families and merchant guilds the means to commission grand churches, soaring palaces, frescoed halls, and public squares adorned with marble figures. To sponsor a philosopher or shelter a poet was not merely an act of private taste, it was an act of power. Of all these cities, Florence was perhaps the most restlessly brilliant. Its wealth rested on 2 intertwined foundations. The first was wool. Beginning in the 13th century, Florence became a great hub of the cloth industry, importing raw wool from England and the Iberian Peninsula, transforming it through the skilled hands of its guilds, particularly the arte di lana, into finely woven cloth that was traded throughout Italy, Northern Europe and the Levant. The profits from this trade were enormous, but as the wool sector began to contract in the 14th century, Florentine families did not retreat. They turned instead to a second foundation, one that would prove even more transformative. They turned to banking. The Florentine gold florin, first minted in 1252, was a coin of remarkable consistency, 3.5 grams of 24-carat gold, bearing the city's lily and the image of St. John the Baptist, unchanged for 3 centuries. In an age when the weight and purity of coinage varied wildly from one territory to the next, the florin was a quiet miracle of reliability. Traders from England to the Levant accepted it without hesitation. It became in effect the common currency of Europe. Built upon this foundation of trust, Florentine banking houses established branches in the great commercial centres of the continent, London, Bruges, Geneva. They accepted deposits, extended credit, financed the campaigns of kings, and managed the accounts of popes. Through instruments such as the bill of exchange and the letter of credit, merchants could settle enormous debts across vast distances without moving a single coin. It was a revolution not of armies but of paper and ledgers, and Florence stood at its centre. Into this world of commerce and ambition was born the Medici family. They had begun modestly enough, a clan from the Mugello countryside, moving to Florence and entering the wool trade, unremarkable among hundreds of similar families in the city's humming mercantile life. But in 1397, a man named Giovanni de' Bicci de' Medici founded the Medici Bank, and everything changed. Through careful management, reliable bookkeeping, and the securing of deposits from the papacy and European monarchs, Giovanni transformed what had been a modest family enterprise into one of the most powerful financial institutions in Europe. When he died in 1429, he left behind not merely a fortune, but a network of influence that stretched across the continent. His son Cosimo would take that inheritance and shape it into something far more subtle and far more lasting. Cosimo de' Medici, known to history as Cosimo the Elder, understood that in Florence naked power was always dangerous. The city's republican traditions, however imperfect in practice, still carried genuine weight in the hearts of its citizens. No man could simply seize the signoria and call himself ruler without inviting catastrophe. And so Cosimo chose a different path. He guided from the shadows. He used the bank's vast wealth to cultivate networks of patronage and obligation across the guilds, financing elections, placing loyal allies in key magistracies, and extending credit to those whose gratitude he needed. He spent generously on public works and the arts, supporting artists such as Donatello, commissioning churches and libraries, not merely out of personal love for beauty, though that too was real, but because generosity on a grand scale created bonds of loyalty that money alone could never purchase. Cosimo never needed a crown. The city moved when he wished it to move, and rested when he wished it to rest. This quiet mastery passed to his grandson, Lorenzo, who would come to be remembered by a title that history rarely bestows lightly: Lorenzo the Magnificent. Born in 1449, Lorenzo de' Medici became the de facto ruler of the Florentine Republic at a time when the Renaissance was reaching the fullness of its power. He maintained the family's tradition of ruling without formal title, guiding the signoria through patronage and influence, directing the city's foreign policy with remarkable skill, and working to preserve the fragile balance of peace among the competing Italian states through his management of the Italic League. But it was not his politics alone that earned him his epithet. It was the world he made possible. Under Lorenzo's patronage, Florence became the luminous centre of the artistic and intellectual world. His support extended to painters whose names would echo through all subsequent centuries. Sandro Botticelli, whose dreaming figures seemed to emerge from the mist of classical mythology. The young Michelangelo, whose hands even in his earliest work showed a power beyond ordinary understanding. Leonardo da Vinci in his Florentine years. Lorenzo financed the work of architects who transformed the city's physical face. Brunelleschi's Great Dome already rose above Florence, an engineering triumph that drew the eye from miles across the Arno Valley. And he funded scholars and philosophers whose ideas would reshape how educated Europeans understood humanity itself. Among these philosophers, two were especially remarkable. Marsilio Ficino, whom Lorenzo supported generously, worked to reconcile the thought of Plato with Christian theology, gathering around him a circle of thinkers at the Platonic Academy that met under Medici patronage. And Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, one of the most daring minds of the age, proposed in his celebrated writings that humanity possessed a dignity unlike any other created thing: the capacity to shape itself, to choose its own nature, to ascend toward wisdom or descend toward ignorance. These were not merely academic arguments. They were expressions of something the city of Florence, with its civic pride and merchant energy, had already been quietly living for generations. Out of this environment grew the Renaissance ideal of the uomo universale, the universal man. The humanist thinker Leon Battista Alberti gave this ideal its clearest voice, insisting that a man could do all things if he willed it. The city-states of Italy, with their academies and workshops, their libraries and guilds, their culture of patronage and public service, created the conditions in which this belief could flourish. Excellence in multiple disciplines became not merely admirable, but expected among those who aspired to the highest reaches of Renaissance life. Yet even this radiant world was not without its shadows. In April of 1478, during Easter Mass in the great Cathedral of Florence, the Pazzi conspiracy unfolded with sudden and terrible violence. The rival Pazzi family, backed by Pope Sixtus IV and several co-conspirators including the Archbishop of Pisa, had planned to murder both Lorenzo and his brother Giuliano simultaneously and seize control of the city. Giuliano was slain where he stood, stabbed repeatedly by Francesco de' Pazzi, but Lorenzo, wounded in the neck, escaped into a sacristy and survived. The conspirators attempted to rouse the city against the Medici but found no welcome. Instead, the citizens of Florence turned upon them. In the days that followed, more than 80 men connected to the plot were executed, many of them hanged from the windows of the Palazzo della Signoria, in full view of the city below. The Pazzi family was exiled. The conspiracy had failed utterly, and in its failure it only deepened the bonds between the Medici and the people they had so carefully cultivated over 3 generations. The Medici's connections extended well beyond Florence, however, reaching into the highest offices of the church itself. The family operated a branch of their bank in Rome that served as the papacy's official financial institution, managing the Vatican's accounts and extending credit to successive popes. These financial ties were gradually woven together with dynastic ambitions. Lorenzo secured a cardinalate for his son Giovanni, who in 1513 ascended to the papacy as Pope Leo X. Later, Giulio de' Medici became Pope Clement VII. Through these extraordinary appointments, the family gained access not merely to the spiritual authority of the church, but to its political and military resources, which they used to protect and restore Medici power in Florence when Republican opposition threatened to dislodge them. Far to the northeast, the city of Venice offered a different vision of what an independent republic could be. Built upon the waters of its lagoon, governed by its doge and a complex architecture of councils and committees, Venice was above all a city of trade. Its economy rested on the movement of goods across the Mediterranean, grain, wine, salt, and shipbuilding from its own territories, and from the east an endless stream of silks, spices, incense, and precious metals. Through favourable treaties and diplomatic arrangements stretching back through centuries, Venice had secured privileged access to Byzantine ports and established trading posts in the Muslim cities of the Levant, Egypt, and North Africa. It was a city that lived between worlds, belonging fully to none of them, drawing sustenance from all. This eastern connection brought more than commerce. After the fall of Constantinople in 1453, Greek scholars carrying precious manuscripts found their way to Venice, bringing with them the texts of ancient philosophy and science that had been preserved in the Byzantine world. These manuscripts, studied and copied in Venetian humanist academies, reinvigorated the intellectual life of Renaissance Italy, reviving the study of the Greek language and opening new dimensions in philosophy and natural inquiry. The visual culture of Venice bore the marks of Byzantium as well, in the golden mosaics that covered the interior of the Basilica of San Marco, in the architectural forms that blended Eastern and Western traditions into something unmistakably Venetian. And then there was Rome. If Florence was the seedbed of the Renaissance and Venice its eastern window, Rome was the stage upon which its grandest ambitions were finally performed. The popes of the 15th and 16th centuries understood the power of spectacle and permanence. They hired the greatest architects and artists of the age to transform their city from a landscape of medieval ruins into a monumental proclamation of Christian authority and classical learning. Pope Sixtus IV launched an ambitious renewal of Rome's urban fabric, founding the Sistine Chapel and drawing artists from across the peninsula to decorate it. But it was Pope Julius II, the warrior pope who reigned from 1503 to 1513, who brought the High Renaissance to its most overwhelming expression in Rome. He commissioned Donato Bramante to design the new Basilica of St. Peter, a project of staggering ambition that would occupy generations of architects and transform the skyline of the Christian world. He persuaded Michelangelo, whose genius had been formed as a sculptor in the workshops of Florence, to abandon other projects and take on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, a labour of 4 years that produced one of the supreme achievements in the history of human making. And on the recommendation of Bramante, he brought to Rome a young painter named Raphael, who decorated the halls of the Vatican Apostolic Palace with frescoes of such serene and luminous perfection that they have never ceased to astonish those who stand before them. The Sforza Dukes of Milan, meanwhile, shaped their own chapter in this unfolding story. Francesco Sforza had seized power in 1450, founding a dynasty that ruled one of the richest and most militarily powerful cities of northern Italy. Under Sforza patronage, Leonardo da Vinci came to Milan and remained for nearly 2 decades, painting the Last Supper on the wall of the refectory of Santa Maria delle Grazie, and working on engineering projects and architectural designs of extraordinary range. The Sforza court became a centre of learning and artistic refinement that rivaled Florence itself. Yet all of this brilliance rested upon fragile foundations. The Italian city-states, for all their wealth and sophistication, were small. When Charles VIII of France descended into Italy in 1494, the first great wave of the Italian wars washed over the peninsula, and the world that the Medici and their contemporaries had built began to fracture. Foreign armies drained treasuries, devastated the countryside, and dismantled the political autonomy that had made the Italian Renaissance possible. Patronage contracted. Artists and scholars, seeking employment and security, carried the ideas and techniques of the Italian masters northward into France, into the Holy Roman Empire, into Spain. The Renaissance, born in the city-states of Italy, became the inheritance of all of Europe. From the palaces of the Medici and the workshops of Florence emerged a generation of artists and thinkers so extraordinary that their names have never faded. Figures whose work still hold mysteries that centuries of scholarship have not fully solved. Chapter 4. The Geniuses and Their Secrets, Leonardo, Michelangelo, Raphael, and the Mysteries of Renaissance Mastery. In the rolling hills of Tuscany on the 15th day of April in the year 1452, a child was born in the small town of Vinci. His name was Leonardo. The son of a Florentine notary and a young peasant woman, he came into the world quietly, without ceremony, raised first in his grandfather's house among olive groves and gentle countryside air. No one who passed through those hills could have imagined what that restless mind would one day hold. As a boy, Leonardo moved between the countryside and his father's household in Florence, absorbing the intellectual currents of that extraordinary city. Around the age of 15, his father arranged for him to enter the workshop of Andrea del Verrocchio, one of Florence's most celebrated artists, a sculptor, painter, and goldsmith whose studio trained many of the era's finest talents. In Verrocchio's workshop, Leonardo began, as all apprentices did, with humble tasks. He ground pigments, prepared wooden panels, and cleaned brushes, but soon the nature of his learning expanded far beyond these routines. He studied drawing from life, the surface anatomy of the human form, the principles of mechanics and engineering, the behaviour of light upon fabric and flesh. It was a multidisciplinary foundation unlike any other, and it would define everything Leonardo later became. What grew from those years in Verrocchio's studio was something the world had never quite seen before. Leonardo did not simply learn to paint beautifully, he learned to see. He dissected human cadavers alongside physicians and medical students, working with careful hands to map muscles, bones, the branching pathways of veins and nerves. He studied animals too, frogs, bears, dogs, monkeys, comparing their structures with human forms, filling page after page with drawings of a precision that no artist before him had achieved. These investigations gave his painted figures a lifelike posture, a tension in the muscles, an expression in the eyes that seemed to breathe. And yet Leonardo's art was only one thread in an endlessly branching mind. His notebooks, thousands upon thousands of pages written in his characteristic mirror script, left to accumulate across a lifetime, contained designs for a self-propelled cart driven by coiled springs, anticipating the automobile by 5 centuries. He sketched a helical air screw capable of vertical flight, a concept that would not become reality until 400 years later. He envisioned an armoured fighting vehicle with rotating cannons, a parachute, a concentrated solar furnace, a double-hulled ship. Most of these inventions were never built in his lifetime, but when scholars and engineers reconstructed them in later centuries, they found them feasible, ideas suspended in time, waiting for the world to catch up. Today, roughly 12,000 surviving pages of Leonardo's notebooks are scattered across institutions throughout Europe and beyond. The largest collection, the Codex Atlanticus, rests in Milan's Biblioteca Ambrosiana, holding over 1,000 leaves. Others are preserved in London, Madrid, Windsor, and in a private collection owned by the modern billionaire who purchased the Codex Leicester at auction. Each page offers another glimpse into a mind that seemed constitutionally unable to rest. And perhaps that restlessness is the great mystery at the heart of Leonardo's life. For all his genius, he left an astonishing number of works unfinished. Paintings abandoned mid-stroke, engineering designs never constructed, scientific inquiries begun and set aside. Historians have long pondered this pattern, and modern scholars have proposed that Leonardo's extraordinary curiosity, his perfectionism, and what some now describe as an attention deficit profile all conspired against completion. He preferred inquiry to conclusion. He was more comfortable with questions than answers, more drawn to the act of discovery than to the finality of a finished thing. His paintings, however, reveal the depth of his attention when it did hold. Among them, the Mona Lisa has become perhaps the most studied portrait in the history of art. A marginal note dated to October 1503, written by a Florentine contemporary named Agostino Vespucci, identifies the sitter as Lisa del Giocondo, the wife of a Florentine merchant. Most scholars accept this identification, yet a small number of others have proposed alternative theories, that the figure might be an idealized composite, a self-portrait rendered in feminine form, or even a young male model dressed as a woman. The face, with its ambiguous expression and softly dissolving edges, invites endless interpretation. Those softly dissolving edges are no accident. Leonardo devised a technique he called sfumato, from the Italian word for smoke, a method of painting with such thin, translucent glazes, layered one over another, that the transitions between light and shadow become imperceptible. He blended these layers with delicate brushes, soft cloths, and sometimes his own fingertips. The result was a face that seemed to emerge from darkness rather than sit against it, a figure with a presence that transcended the flatness of paint on wood. Sfumato gave the Mona Lisa her atmospheric depth, her ambiguous smile, the sense that she exists in a space slightly beyond reach. In his great mural of the Last Supper, Leonardo encoded something still more complex. The composition was constructed with rigorous geometric care. The lines of the painted ceiling and walls converge not quite upon Christ's face but upon a point just beside it, drawing the eye toward a space that scholars have interpreted as a silent visual cue, the presence of something beyond the visible. The 12 disciples are arranged in 4 groups of 3, echoing Trinitarian numerology. The overall dimensions of the painted space approach the proportions of the golden ratio. Modern imaging has revealed layers of pentiment beneath the surface, evidence of earlier arrangements, a Judas positioned differently, hands repositioned in earlier drafts, suggesting that Leonardo's narrative intentions were far more layered than the finished image alone reveals. Beyond the structural geometry, researchers have pointed to the androgynous quality of the figure traditionally identified as the youthful John seated beside Christ, noting the deliberate softness of the face, a quality that some have connected to hidden theological messages about divine unity, transcending conventional categories. Whether these readings reflect Leonardo's intentions or the projections of later centuries, they reflect something undeniable: that Leonardo's mind worked on multiple levels simultaneously, folding meaning within meaning, concealing as much as he revealed. His personal beliefs remain equally layered. Leonardo is widely regarded as a man of Catholic faith, yet one who approached the divine as a supreme abstract force, rather than a figure of doctrine. He was deeply engaged with Platonic and Aristotelian philosophy, and certain cryptic symbols in his notebooks have led scholars to suggest an interest in hermetic and alchemical traditions, the philosopher's stone, transmutation, the hidden correspondences between nature and spirit. No evidence connects him formally to any secret society, and most historians regard his beliefs as a deeply personal synthesis, Catholic faith braided with philosophical inquiry, and a quasi-mystical empiricism that saw art, science, and the search for hidden truths as expressions of the same impulse. Across the city, in a different workshop, a different kind of genius was taking shape. Michelangelo Buonarroti was born in 1475, the son of a minor government official in the Florentine suburb of Caprese. As a boy, he showed little interest in formal schooling, and far more in the company of artists. At 13, he was apprenticed to the painter Domenico Ghirlandaio, where his skill in drawing and sculpting so distinguished him that Lorenzo de' Medici himself, the most powerful patron in Florence, asked Ghirlandaio to send his two best pupils. Michelangelo was one of them. He moved into the Medici household, entered Lorenzo's informal art academy, and was immersed in a world of classical antiquities, humanist scholarship, and philosophical conversation that would shape every major work of his long life. In Lorenzo's household, Michelangelo encountered Marsilio Ficino, the great Neoplatonic philosopher, and Angelo Poliziano, the poet-translator. He absorbed a synthesis of Christian doctrine and Neoplatonic ideas, the belief in the soul's ascent toward a single divine source, the ideal of the contemplative life, and mystical currents from Jewish Kabbalistic teachings that also circulated in the Medici court. These ideas did not remain abstract, they entered his hands and his stone. Michelangelo once said that the statue already existed within the marble before he carved it, that the sculptor's task was not to create, but to reveal, to strip away the excess stone and free the hidden figure. This belief was not merely a poetic notion. It reflected his deepest philosophical conviction that ideal forms exist prior to matter, that beauty is pre-existent in the divine mind, and that the artist is a conduit through whom the universal becomes visible. In 1501, at the age of 26, Michelangelo received a commission that would test this philosophy against an extraordinary challenge. A massive block of marble, known simply as Il Gigante, the giant, had been attempted and abandoned by two earlier sculptors. It was flawed, awkward in proportion, and had sat unfinished for decades. From this imperfect stone, Michelangelo carved the David. Over 3 years of labour, he chiselled a figure 5 meters tall. a young man poised before an unseen enemy, his muscles taut with readiness, his gaze steady and unafraid. The contrapposto stance, the vivid anatomical precision, the psychological tension held in that suspended moment before action, all of it conspired to make the David not merely a statue but a symbol. When the council decided where to place it, they set it in the open air of the Piazza della Signoria, where it became an emblem of Florentine civic liberty. In 1873 it was moved indoors to the Galleria dell'Accademia, where it still stands, protected from the centuries it was never meant to outlive. 7 years later, in 1508, Pope Julius II summoned Michelangelo to Rome and presented him with a commission he did not want. The sculptor, who thought of himself as a man of stone rather than paint, was asked to fresco the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. He suggested his younger rival Raphael instead. The Pope refused. Michelangelo accepted, and for 4 grueling years he laboured on a platform of his own design, a mobile scaffold suspended from brackets high in the chapel walls, working on wet plaster in the buon fresco technique, applying pigment before the plaster set section by section across a surface of over 500 square metres above his head. The theological program he developed, whether from his own design or in dialogue with learned theologians such as Cardinal Giles of Viterbo, wove together Genesis, the prophets, the pagan Sibyls, and a Neoplatonic vision of humanity's divine origin and yearning for return. More than 300 figures inhabited the ceiling when he finished in 1512. At its centre, in the scene of the creation of Adam, a muscular human form reaches toward a divine hand across a void of space, fingertips nearly touching. An image so perfectly suspended between contact and separation that it has never quite left the imagination of anyone who has looked upon it. Neoplatonic ideas, Kabbalistic symbols, hermetic structures, these currents flowed through the Renaissance not only in Michelangelo's chapel, but throughout the artistic programs of the age. Marsilio Ficino's synthesis of Platonic philosophy and Christian theology had established a framework in which physical beauty was understood as a mirror of transcendent truth, and the contemplation of beauty as a path toward the divine. This philosophy animated the mythological paintings of Sandro Botticelli, his Birth of Venus and Primavera, in which the goddess Venus represented the soul's emergence into the world, surrounded by figures drawn from classical allegory and filtered through Neoplatonic interpretation. The 3 Graces, Zephyr and Chloris, Mercury, Cupid and Flora, all participated in a narrative of spiritual ascent from earthly attraction to higher intellectual love. During the same decades, the architectural genius of Filippo Brunelleschi had already demonstrated that the ancient world could be not merely imitated but surpassed. His dome for Florence's cathedral, completed in 1436 after a solution that had been deemed impossible, rose without external buttresses, without the prohibitive centering of traditional wooden scaffolding. Brunelleschi built it in self-supporting horizontal layers, using a double shell construction held together by herringbone brick patterns and iron tension rings, a feat of engineering that still draws the eyes of visitors upward in disbelief. He had also formalized the geometric system of linear perspective around 1415, a discovery codified by Leon Battista Alberti in his 1435 treatise on painting. This system, converging orthogonal lines meeting at a single vanishing point, gave Renaissance artists the mathematical means to render 3-dimensional space on a flat surface with convincing depth and coherence, and it transformed visual representation as profoundly as any other invention of the age. These innovations accumulated around the figure of Raphael like tributaries feeding a great river. Born Raffaello Sanzio da Urbino in 1483, Raphael lived only 37 years, yet in that brief span he synthesized the greatest achievements of his age into something entirely his own. From Leonardo he drew the softly shadowed modelling, the atmospheric depth, the psychological nuance that makes a painted face seem to hold a thought. From Michelangelo he absorbed the sculptural dynamism, the monumental presence, the expressive tension of figures that seem almost to move. Between 1509 and 1511, working in the Vatican for Pope Julius II, Raphael painted the School of Athens on the wall of the Pope's private library, an imagined gathering of the great minds of antiquity, arranged beneath a vast classical vault inspired by the architecture of Bramante. At the centre of the fresco stand Plato and Aristotle. Plato points upward toward the realm of ideal forms. Aristotle gestures outward toward the observable world. Around them, Pythagoras sketches geometric diagrams, Euclid demonstrates a theorem, Diogenes reclines in solitary indifference. The brooding figure of Heraclitus, writing alone on a marble block, was modelled on Michelangelo himself, and among the assembled faces, Raphael placed his own, a quiet, watchful presence at the edge of eternity, looking out from a gathering of the greatest minds humanity had ever imagined. The School of Athens was more than a celebration of antiquity. It was a visual argument, the claim that human reason, in all its forms, was sacred, that the pursuit of knowledge was itself a kind of worship, that beauty, proportion, and intellectual clarity were not decorations of the divine but expressions of it. These were the convictions that animated the extraordinary figures of the Renaissance. Artists who were also scientists, philosophers who expressed their ideas in paint and stone, visionaries who encoded their deepest beliefs in geometry and light. Leonardo, with his mirror-written notebooks and his sfumato-veiled portraits. Michelangelo, freeing angels from marble and covering a chapel ceiling with the entire story of creation. Raphael, weaving together the living and the ancient in a single harmonious vision. They were masters of the visible world and something more, seekers who believed, each in their own way, that the visible world concealed deeper truths and that art was the key that might slowly and gently unlock them. Yet even as these extraordinary artists shaped the visible world of the Renaissance, another revolution was quietly unfolding, one that would prove equally transformative, spreading ideas not across city squares and cathedral ceilings, but across the entire continent and eventually the world. Chapter 5: The Information Revolution, Gutenberg, Humanism, Machiavelli, and the Birth of the Modern Mind. Somewhere in the quiet city of Mainz, in the middle years of the 15th century, a German craftsman bent over a workbench surrounded by small pieces of cast metal. His name was Johannes Gutenberg, and what he was assembling in that modest workshop would, in time, alter the course of human civilization more profoundly than almost any invention before or since. Gutenberg's genius was not found in a single dramatic moment of discovery. It was the patient marriage of several existing ideas into one elegant working system. He developed a durable metal alloy that could be poured quickly into a hand mould, cooling fast enough to produce reusable type by the hundreds. He formulated a thick oil-based ink that adhered cleanly to metal and transferred evenly onto paper or vellum. He adapted the familiar mechanism of the wine press, its great wooden screw, capable of applying steady, even pressure, and turned it into something entirely new. By around 1440, and certainly by 1455, when the now famous Gutenberg Bible emerged from his workshop, Europe's first practical movable type printing system was alive and working. The first texts to pass through that press were sacred ones. The Latin Vulgate Bible, the Psalter, catechisms, and ecclesiastical works flowed outward in quantities no monastery scriptorium could ever have matched. A single press could produce thousands of copies in the time a scribe might hand-copy one. At the Ripoli press in Florence, it was later recorded that 1,025 copies of a text could be printed for the cost of 3 florins, a reduction of more than 300 times the price of a single handwritten copy. Books, which had once been objects of extraordinary value and rarity, began their slow, steady journey toward the hands of ordinary people. The spread of the press across Europe followed like a quiet tide moving through a sleeping landscape. By 1460, presses had appeared in Strasbourg, by the mid-1460s in Cologne, Basel, and soon after in Nuremberg, Augsburg, and then across the Alps into Italy, France, Spain, the Netherlands, England, Bohemia, and Poland. By the year 1500, the press had reached roughly 270 cities, and more than 9 million printed books were in circulation across the continent. Where once there had been only a few thousand manuscripts in all of Europe, there were now millions of voices speaking across distance and time. Those voices did not speak only of scripture. They carried philosophy, poetry, medicine, mathematics, and history. And above all, they carried the ideas of a movement that had been quietly growing in Italy for well over a century. A movement scholars would come to call Renaissance humanism. The roots of that movement stretched back to a solitary Italian scholar walking the dusty roads of the 14th century. Francesco Petrarca, known to history as Petrarch, had felt deeply that something had been lost. The civilization of ancient Rome, with its elegance of thought, its moral seriousness, its eloquence, and its vision of the dignified life, had been buried beneath centuries of theological preoccupation. In 1345, during a diplomatic mission to Verona, Petrarch discovered among crumbling Latin manuscripts the personal letters of Cicero. It was as though a long silent voice had spoken again across the centuries. Petrarch became the first to articulate what would become the humanist program, that secular learning could illuminate the human soul, that the moral and rhetorical wisdom of antiquity was not merely pagan curiosity, but a genuine gift to civilization. After Petrarch, other scholars followed his path into the forgotten libraries of monasteries and cathedral chapters. Among the most remarkable of these was Gianfrancesco Poggio Bracciolini, a papal secretary and gifted humanist who travelled through German, Swiss and French monastic libraries in the early 15th century and returned with treasures that had been lost to general knowledge for 1,000 years. He recovered Lucretius's philosophical poem De Rerum Natura, Vitruvius's architectural manual, lost orations of Cicero, and the complete rhetorical masterwork of Quintilian, among many others. Each manuscript he brought back was a window reopened onto a world that European scholars had only dimly remembered. These discoveries did not merely satisfy antiquarian curiosity, they transformed what scholars believed knowledge was for. Medieval scholasticism had been a grand and carefully constructed system. It placed all inquiry beneath the canopy of Christian theology, subordinating philosophy to the defense of doctrinal truth and treating the natural world primarily as a shadow of divine intention. The goal of learning in that framework was ultimately the preparation of the soul for eternity. Humanists did not necessarily reject faith, but they insisted that human life on earth had its own dignity, its own purpose, its own beauty worth cultivating. They proposed the Studia Humanitatis, a curriculum of grammar, rhetoric, poetry, history, and moral philosophy drawn from classical sources as the foundation of a well-rounded and fully realized human life. This was a gentle but deeply consequential shift. The human being in the humanist vision was not merely a fallen creature awaiting redemption. He was, as they often expressed it, the crown and glory of creation, endowed with reason and creativity and a capacity for self-improvement that deserved to be celebrated and developed. As the printing press multiplied the texts of this revival and carried them northward across the Alps, the movement took on new dimensions. In the Low Countries, a scholar of extraordinary range and gentle wit had grown into the undisputed voice of Northern European humanism. Desiderius Erasmus of Rotterdam, born around 1466, earned the title that his contemporaries bestowed upon him, the Prince of the Humanists. He produced critical editions of classical texts, offered a new Latin translation of the New Testament that called scholars back to the original sources, and wrote with elegant irony about the corruption and formalism that had settled over the Church. His praise of folly was not an angry polemic, but a gentle, knowing smile at human pretension, including the pretensions of clergy and pope alike. Erasmus wished to reform the Church from within, to restore it to what he believed was its original spiritual clarity. He remained loyal to Rome even as his writings helped stoke the fires of Reformation that would soon burn beyond any scholar's control. For the printing press had already made possible what no individual humanist had intended or foreseen. In 1517, a German monk named Martin Luther nailed a set of theological propositions to a church door, and within weeks, printed copies of those arguments were circulating across dozens of cities. The press transformed what might have been a quiet academic dispute into a continent-wide conversation that could no longer be silenced. Religious dissent, once a whisper confined to monastery corridors, became a shout heard across taverns, town squares, and parish churches. Even those who could not read could listen as others read aloud. The information environment of Europe had been permanently altered. Yet humanism did not only reshape theology, it reshaped the very idea of political life. And nowhere was that transformation more quietly radical than in a modest country house outside Florence, where a former diplomat sat in exile and wrote by candlelight. Niccolò Machiavelli had been born in Florence in 1469, and for 14 years, from 1498 to 1512, he had served the Florentine Republic as Secretary of the Second Chancery, a senior official responsible for foreign affairs and the organisation of a citizen militia. He had travelled as a diplomat to the courts of France and to the papal palaces of Rome. He had observed firsthand the fragile negotiations, the sudden reversals of alliance, and the cold pragmatism that governed the politics of the Italian peninsula. He had watched the brilliant and ruthless Cesare Borgia consolidate power with a combination of vision and calculated cruelty. He had witnessed the Medici family, expelled from Florence in 1494, return in 1512 with the support of Spanish troops, overthrowing the republic he had served and consigning him to dismissal, brief imprisonment, and enforced exile. It was in that exile, in the spring and autumn of 1513, that Machiavelli composed the short, startling treatise he called The Prince. He wrote it partly as a petition, hoping to regain favour with the returning Medici, and dedicated it first to Giuliano de' Medici and later to Lorenzo de' Medici. But whatever his personal motivations, what emerged from those months of quiet, bitter reflection was something that European political thought had never quite seen before. Machiavelli's central argument was both simple and disturbing. A ruler's primary obligation was not to embody Christian virtue, not to reflect the moral order of the divine, but to acquire, consolidate, and maintain power in a world as it actually existed, not as theologians or idealists imagined it should be. Human beings, in his unsentimental view, were largely self-interested, and a prince who governed on the assumption that gratitude and goodwill were reliable foundations was building on sand. It was safer, Machiavelli observed, to be feared than loved when one could not be both. The ends, when the survival of the state was at stake, could justify means that conventional morality would condemn. The successful ruler required what Machiavelli called virtu, not virtue in the Christian sense, but a flexible, responsive combination of intelligence, decisiveness, and the willingness to act appropriately in changing circumstances. This was a departure from centuries of political philosophy. Medieval thinkers had woven governance and theology together inseparably, imagining the ideal ruler as a reflection of divine order, his legitimacy grounded in moral and religious authority. Machiavelli severed that connection. Politics, in his analysis, was its own domain, governed by its own logic, which had nothing inherently to do with the justice of heaven. Over the centuries that followed, readers would argue endlessly about what Machiavelli truly intended. Many read The Prince as a handbook for cynical tyranny, a cold endorsement of ruthlessness dressed in the language of realism. Others, particularly modern scholars, have suggested that the text is something more nuanced, perhaps even ironic, a sober analysis of how power actually functions, or a sophisticated warning to citizens about the nature of despotism, written by a man whose deepest loyalties lay with Republican Florence. His other major works lend weight to this second reading. In the Discourses on Livy, Machiavelli argued at length for the superiority of republican government, the importance of civic participation, and the stabilizing role of popular assemblies in checking the power of princes. In The Art of War, he insisted that military strength must rest on a disciplined citizen militia rather than mercenary soldiers. That war was the business of the whole state and of its people. Whatever his final intentions, Machiavelli had done something irreversible. He had looked at political life with clear, unsentimentalized eyes and described what he saw. In doing so, he had planted the seed of a tradition of political realism that would grow across the following centuries, sometimes wisely and sometimes dangerously, into the modern world. The humanism that had shaped Machiavelli's intellectual formation was also, quietly and steadily, reshaping the relationship between scholarship and the natural world. By returning to classical sources with the philologist's eye, humanist scholars had developed a rigorous critical method, comparing manuscripts, correcting corruptions, restoring original languages, and refusing to accept received authority without examination. This habit of mind, applied to the texts of Aristotle and the medical writings of Galen, began to reveal inconsistencies that no amount of reverence could explain away. If the ancient masters could be shown to have erred on questions of language and history, might they not also have erred on questions of anatomy, astronomy, or the motion of the heavens? The intellectual climate that humanism had created made such questions not only thinkable but admirable. Scholars like Nicholas of Cusa, a German cardinal and polymath who lived from 1401 to 1464, had already begun to push against the boundaries of the medieval cosmos, questioning the geocentric model of Ptolemy and contemplating the possibility that the universe was infinite in ways that human reason could never fully comprehend. His concept of learned ignorance, the recognition that human knowledge was always bounded by the infinite complexity of the divine creation, was itself a kind of intellectual humility that paradoxically opened the door to endless investigation. The universities of Europe, meanwhile, were slowly absorbing the humanist curriculum, as scholars trained in Italy carried the new philological methods and broader intellectual horizons back to England, France, Germany, and the Low Countries. The printing press amplified everything. The works of Plato and Aristotle, of Cicero and Seneca and Virgil were now reproduced in reliable editions and distributed across the continent at a speed and scale that no previous generation could have imagined. students who had never travelled to Florence or Rome could now sit in their northern studies and read the same texts that had animated the great conversations of Italian humanism. Knowledge was becoming for the first time something that could accumulate and compound across generations, carried forward not in the fragile memory of a single monastery, but in thousands of identical printed pages scattered across every corner of the known world. This was not merely a change in the mechanics of book production, it was a transformation in the very nature of thought, in who could think, who could question, who could speak and be heard. The medieval world had been organised around hierarchy and transmission, knowledge flowing downward from the authority of Scripture and its interpreters. The world that Gutenberg, Petrarch, Erasmus and Machiavelli had helped to call into being was one where knowledge flowed outward in every direction, through printed pages and university halls, through diplomatic letters and vernacular pamphlets, through the quiet reading of a craftsman's daughter and the systematic observations of an astronomer scanning the night sky. As new ideas spread beyond Italian borders and the boundaries of the known world began to dissolve under the footsteps of explorers and the curiosity of scientists, the Renaissance transformed from a regional awakening into a global turning point whose consequences would be felt for centuries. Chapter 6: The Legacy of the Renaissance, Lost Worlds, Enduring Mysteries, and the Civilization that was reborn. There is a particular quality to the light at the end of a great age. It does not simply fade, it scatters, moving outward in every direction, carried by ships and manuscripts and quiet conversations in candlelit rooms, until what once burned in a single city becomes the slow, steady warmth that illuminates an entire world. The Renaissance did not end so much as it transformed, and to understand what it left behind, one must first understand what it became, and what, in becoming, it could never fully leave. At its highest point, the High Renaissance stood as perhaps the most concentrated flowering of artistic genius in the history of European civilization. Between the early 1490s and the sack of Rome in 1527, a brief span of years produced works of such balance, beauty, and expressive power that the world has spent 5 centuries trying to understand them. Leonardo da Vinci painted The Last Supper and the Mona Lisa, and filled his notebooks with anatomical studies and flights of mechanical imagination that still hold their mysteries. Michelangelo shaped the Pietà from marble, carved the David from a single block of stone, and painted the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel with figures so full of weight and breath that they seemed to press outward from the plaster. Raphael rendered the School of Athens, or that serene gathering of classical minds, with a harmony so complete it seemed less like a painting and more like a dream of what civilization could be. And Bramante designed the Tempietto, that small circular chapel in Rome whose proportions carry within them the whole idea of classical unity. These were not merely beautiful things, they were arguments made in paint and stone and architecture about what it meant to be human. But even as those arguments were being formed, the world that had made them possible was beginning to tremble. The Italian Wars, which had begun in 1494 when the French King Charles VIII descended on the peninsula to press his claim to Naples, did not end quickly. For 65 years, the city-states of Italy found themselves caught between the ambitions of France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire. Their delicate political balances shattered, their patronage networks strained, their wealth slowly drained by conflict after conflict. Artists and scholars were scattered. Some fled, some sought new patrons in courts beyond the Alps. The elegant world of Florentine and Roman cultural life, which had nurtured humanism for more than a century, found itself bruised and diminished. And then came the morning of May the 6th, 1527, when the troops of Charles V broke through the walls of Rome. What followed was not merely a military event, it was a rupture. The workshops closed, the commissions vanished. The painters and sculptors and architects who had gathered in Rome, drawn by the patronage of popes and cardinals, by the presence of ancient ruins, by the sense that this city was the living heart of Renaissance civilization, were scattered almost overnight. The churches were looted. Liturgical objects, paintings, tapestries, and ancient sculptures were stripped away, turned into commodities or destroyed in moments of iconoclastic violence. The papal treasury that had funded the great works of Michelangelo and Bramante ceased to function as a centre of cultural life. Rome, which had become the axis of the High Renaissance, was broken, and from that breaking something new was born, or perhaps more accurately, something strange. The movement that historians call mannerism emerged in the years following the High Renaissance, carried by younger artists who had mastered everything their predecessors had achieved and found themselves asking what came next. The name derives from the Italian word maniera, meaning style or manner, and it described an art that turned away from the calm equilibrium of Leonardo and Raphael, embracing instead elongated figures, unsettling colours, ambiguous spaces, and a tension that seemed to have no easy resolution. Mannerism reflected the turbulent climate of the 16th century. The Reformation fracturing the Church, the sack of Rome destroying a cultural world, shifting patronage creating uncertainty everywhere. It was art that acknowledged instability, that wore its intelligence on its surface, that emphasized the artist's individual manner as the primary subject. It was in its way a kind of honest response to a world that had lost its confidence in easy harmony. Meanwhile, the Protestant Reformation was reshaping not only religion, but the entire economy of cultural production. When Martin Luther and his successors challenged papal authority, rejecting indulgences, insisting on the primacy of scripture, promoting vernacular worship and condemning the moral failings of the clergy, they did not merely create theological controversy. They disrupted the patronage networks that had sustained Renaissance art for generations. Catholic funding for religious imagery declined in Protestant territories. Artists were forced to seek new markets, to explore secular subjects, to adapt their skills to the demands of private collectors and civic institutions. Humanism spread further and faster, paradoxically, as its economic foundations were altered. The Catholic Church, for its part, responded with the Counter-Reformation, a vast, sustained effort to correct internal abuses, reaffirm doctrine, and reclaim the spiritual allegiance of Europe. Centred on the Council of Trent, which met across nearly 2 decades between 1545 and 1563, the Counter-Reformation promoted a new kind of art, emotionally direct, dramatically compelling, designed to move the heart and inspire devotion rather than to invite quiet philosophical contemplation. From this impulse came the Baroque, the thunderous canvases of Caravaggio, the sweeping sculptures of Bernini, the richly decorated churches that turned religious experience into something overwhelming and immediate. The Counter-Reformation also built seminaries and Jesuit colleges that revitalized Catholic education, producing a scholarly culture that integrated art, music, theology, and intellectual inquiry into a unified program of spiritual renewal. The Renaissance, in other words, did not simply end. It fractured into mannerism, into the Baroque, into the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation, each fragment carrying within it something of the original impulse, transformed by the pressures of a changing world. But beneath all these transformations, something quieter and perhaps more enduring was also happening. The Renaissance had always been, at its deepest level, a story about knowledge, about what had been lost, what had been preserved, and what it meant to recover the past. Historians have long wondered whether the Renaissance truly deserved its name, whether it was a genuine rebirth of classical civilization, or simply the gradual culmination of a long process of preservation and transmission that had never truly stopped. Some scholars, following Jacob Burckhardt's early vision, emphasized the radical novelty of the period, the sudden surge of humanism, the flowering of art and science, the break with ecclesiastical dominance. Others, like Wallace Ferguson, described the changes as a slow transition in which new urban and secular forces gradually outweighed medieval structures. Even George Sarton, who early in his career dismissed the Renaissance as disappointing to the history of science, later celebrated its scientific innovations as a genuine new beginning, something sudden and permanent, like a mutation in the life of a civilization. The truth, perhaps, lies somewhere in both views. Classical knowledge had never entirely disappeared. It had been carried through the centuries by Byzantine scribes preserving Greek codices in monastic libraries, by Arab scholars translating Alexandrian texts in the great intellectual centres of Baghdad and Damascus, by translators in Spain and Sicily rendering Arabic works into Latin for European readers. When the fall of Constantinople in 1453 sent Byzantine scholars westward carrying manuscripts, they brought with them a treasure of texts that had survived through centuries of careful stewardship, and those texts fed directly into the Renaissance revival. The Library of Alexandria, that most mythologized of lost repositories, had not been destroyed in a single catastrophic moment. It had suffered a series of losses: a fire during Caesar's siege in 48 BCE, gradual decline under Roman rule, a probable blow during the Palmyrene invasion of the 3rd century, and the final destruction of its subsidiary collection in the Serapeum in 391 CE. Yet many of the works that had once lived on its shelves survived in copies, scattered to Pergamon, Constantinople, and the Arabic-speaking world, preserved in fragments and quotations and occasional complete texts that filtered back into European hands through the long, winding pathways of Byzantine and Islamic transmission. Among the most mysterious of those recovered texts were those gathered in the Corpus Hermeticum, a collection of Greek dialogues attributed to the legendary sage Hermes Trismegistus, blending Platonic philosophy, Gnostic thought, and Egyptian religious ideas into a vision of divine unity, the purification of the soul, and the correspondence between the cosmic and the human. Around 1460, a manuscript of these dialogues arrived in Florence, brought by an agent of Cosimo de' Medici. The patron ordered Marsilio Ficino to set aside his translations of Plato and render the Hermetic texts into Latin first. So urgent did they seem. Ficino complied, and the resulting Latin edition, first published in 1463 and reprinted dozens of times, sparked a Hermetic revival that became one of the most quietly powerful currents of Renaissance intellectual life. The Medici themselves embraced the Hermetic and Neoplatonic tradition not merely as ornament but as philosophy. By founding the Platonic Academy and financing Ficino's translations, by embedding humanist values into Florentine civic life, they used art and scholarship as the instruments of a coherent philosophical program, one that promoted moral improvement, civic republicanism, and the revival of classical wisdom. The Hermetic themes of divine unity, the human body as microcosm of the cosmos, and the ascent of the soul found their way into the paintings of Botticelli, into the anatomical studies of Leonardo, into the very vocabulary of Renaissance visual culture. And Leonardo himself remains perhaps the deepest mystery the Renaissance left behind. The true origins of his inspirations the hidden meanings embedded in his works, the scattered notebooks full of mirror-written observations on anatomy, mechanics, optics, and flight. All of it continues to resist complete understanding. The identity of figures painted beside mathematical instruments, the possibility of encoded ciphers in the geometry of his compositions, the question of what philosophical or spiritual tradition guided his most private investigations, these remain open questions that modern scholarship has not fully resolved. The Renaissance was also, in ways that its European participants could not entirely have anticipated, a threshold into a larger world. The age of exploration that unfolded alongside the humanist revival was no coincidence. The same spirit of rational inquiry, empirical observation, and confidence in human capacity that had driven Brunelleschi to map perspective and Ficino to translate Plato also drove Columbus across the Atlantic in 1492, Vespucci to the recognition that an entirely new continent lay before European eyes, and Magellan's crew to complete the first circumnavigation of the globe between 1519 and 1522. These voyages shattered the medieval conviction that classical authorities like Ptolemy had described a complete and knowable world. They forced philosophers and theologians to confront the existence of peoples and lands nowhere mentioned in Scripture. They expanded the Renaissance worldview from a Eurocentric revival of antiquity to something genuinely global, and in doing so they helped lay the conceptual foundations for the scientific revolution that would follow. Nicolaus Copernicus, working through the humanist tradition of recovering and critically synthesizing ancient texts, combined meticulous astronomical observation with mathematical analysis to propose, in his 1543 work De Revolutionibus, that the sun rather than the earth stood at the centre of planetary motion. Galileo Galilei built upon that foundation by fusing Renaissance habits of careful observation and artistic precision with rigorous experimental method, rolling balls down inclined planes, training his telescope on the moons of Jupiter, measuring and recording and insisting that natural phenomena must be described in the language of mathematics. The intellectual climate that Renaissance humanism had created, the confidence in human reason, the belief that knowledge should be examined critically rather than simply accepted from tradition, made the scientific revolution not merely possible but almost inevitable. And through all of these transformations, the Renaissance reshaped something even more fundamental: the way European civilization understood what a human being was. The movement from a theological view of the person as a contemplative soul, bound by divine hierarchy, to a humanist vision of the individual as a self-aware creature of intrinsic dignity and active capacity, capable of shaping his own destiny, of ascending toward the angelic while remaining grounded in the world. This shift echoed through every subsequent century. It laid the groundwork for modern conceptions of personal rights and civic responsibility, for Machiavelli's unsentimental analysis of political power, for the recovery of Roman law and the emergence of constitutionalism, for the gradual development of representative government and democratic institutions across Europe. Even in religious life, the Renaissance altered something that formal movements could not fully contain. By fostering personal devotion, by spreading vernacular translations of sacred texts, by making contemplative literature accessible through the printing press, by creating visual art that offered intimate pathways to spiritual experience, the Renaissance shifted the centre of religious gravity from the institution toward the individual, a movement that ran beneath and alongside the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation, quieter than either, but perhaps equally lasting. The Renaissance should also be remembered, as scholarship has slowly come to understand, not as a purely European achievement, but as a flower grown from global roots. The Arabic scholars who preserved and transmitted Greek philosophy, science, and medicine while adding their own original contributions in algebra, optics, and astronomy, were indispensable to the revival that followed. The Chinese innovations in papermaking and printing, the navigational instruments refined across Asian and Islamic traditions, the vibrant trade routes of the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean that carried ideas and artistic motifs alongside goods and spices, all of these fed into the intellectual toolkit of Renaissance thinkers, making the period a truly transcultural milestone rather than a story Europe told only about itself. What remains mysterious is as significant as what is known. The true origins and transmission routes of the Corpus Hermeticum continue to resist complete reconstruction. The exact technical methods behind Leonardo's most ambitious inventions remain disputed. The complex networks of patronage and informal intellectual exchange that allowed humanist ideas to spread so rapidly across Italy and Northern Europe are only partially mapped. The precise ways in which Arabic scientific texts were adapted and integrated into European thought remain incompletely understood. And the question of how Renaissance philosophy blended with lingering scholastic, theological, and mystical traditions, how the new and the old quietly negotiated their coexistence, is one that scholarship continues to explore without having fully settled. These mysteries are not failures of knowledge. They are, in a sense, the Renaissance's most enduring gift, the reminder that even the most thoroughly studied chapter of human history still holds rooms that have not yet been opened, corridors that have not yet been fully walked, and so the Renaissance rests, not as a finished chapter of history, but as an open question carried quietly forward through every library, every canvas, and every mind that has ever dared to look beyond the visible world into the deeper mystery of what humanity truly knows and what it has yet to remember.